In the pre-dawn darkness of the Hurtgen Forest, November 1944, where the fog rolled so thick it felt like breathing wool, Private First Class Daniel Mercer crouched behind a shattered oak stump with his M1903 Springfield and realized he was fighting blind. The mist wasn't the clean white stuff of morning meadows back in Montana. This was industrial fog, born from rain-soaked earth meeting frozen air, carrying the smell of pine sap and cordite and something worse he didn't want to name. Visibility had collapsed to maybe 15 yards on a good moment, 10 most times, and sometimes he could barely see his own hands when he held them out. The German patrol was out there. He'd heard their boots squelching through mud 20 minutes ago, heard the low guttural consonants of their conversation, heard the metallic click of a machine gun being repositioned. But hearing wasn't enough when you needed to thread a bullet through air currents you couldn't see, past trees you couldn't count, into a target you could only imagine. Mercer was 23 years old, a hunter's son from Kalispell who'd grown up reading Wind and Grass Waves and Cottonwood Shimmer, who'd been taught by his grandfather to watch for mirage on hot days and feel for breeze direction on his cheek. But all that training assumed you could see something, and the fog had stolen sight entirely. His spotter, Jimmy Rask from Pennsylvania, had been evacuated 2 days prior with trench foot so severe his toes had started turning black, which left Mercer alone on this Godawful ridge with orders to interdict German movements through the forest corridor while his company regrouped 300 yards back. The problem wasn't marksmanship. He'd qualified expert, could put 5 rounds in a fist-sized group at 300 yards on the range. The problem was that in fog all the rules changed. Wind didn't behave. You couldn't see mirage shimmer to judge air movement. You couldn't see leaves fluttering or grass bending. The fog pressed down like a wet blanket and underneath it the air moved in strange currents, swirling around tree trunks, funneling through gaps in the canopy, creating eddies and vortices that would grab a bullet mid-flight and push it 6 inches left or 8 inches right, enough to turn a perfect shot into a miss that smacked harmlessly into a tree. He'd already wasted 4 rounds yesterday trying to hit a German who'd been standing still. Actually standing still, presenting the easiest target imaginable, and all 4 shots had vanished into white nothing with no impact he could confirm. The Germans had laughed. He'd heard that, their laughter rolling through the fog like they were ghosts mocking him. His lieutenant had been clear. The fog was supposed to be their friend, concealing their positions, but it was concealing the enemy too and more effectively because the Germans were moving with confidence, using the weather like they owned it. His company had taken 11 casualties in 2 days, mostly from machine gun fire that seemed to come from nowhere, from teams that would set up in the fog, rake a position, and vanish before anyone could respond. Mercer had been tasked with changing that equation, with making the fog dangerous for the enemy, but after a day and a half he'd accomplished exactly nothing except wasting ammunition and confirming that everything he knew about shooting was useless in these conditions. The breakthrough came from bootlaces, of all things, or rather from the frayed piece of paracord he'd been using to reinforce his left boot after the original lace had snapped. He'd been sitting there in the fog, rifle across his knees, eating a cold can of hash, when he noticed the cord end dangling from his boot. Maybe 8 inches of loose string, and it was moving, not swaying in obvious wind, but twisting slowly, spiraling in place, responsive to air currents so subtle, he couldn't feel them on his skin. He stopped chewing and watched it for a full minute. The fog around him was perfectly still, or seemed to be, but the string was definitely turning, clockwise, then pausing, then counterclockwise, reacting to micro-movements of air that were invisible to his eyes and imperceptible to his face. His grandfather had taught him that wind wasn't a single thing but a river with currents, and in forests it got complicated fast. Air would hit a tree and split, would sink into hollows, would accelerate through gaps, would create pockets of stillness surrounded by movement. The string was reading something his eyes couldn't. He pulled the cord loose from his boot, tied one end around the front sight post of his Springfield, and let about 6 inches dangle down. The string hung there, darkened by morning dew, and as he watched it began that same slow twist. He moved the rifle left and the string's movement changed character slightly. He moved it right and it spiraled differently. The fog hadn't thinned at all. He still couldn't see more than a few yards, but suddenly he had information about what the air was doing in his immediate space, air that would affect his bullet for at least the first crucial seconds of flight. It wasn't a complete solution. He still couldn't see the target, still couldn't judge distance accurately, still couldn't account for what happened to the bullet after it left his sphere of influence and entered the fog's deeper mysteries. But it was something. It was a piece of data in a void of ignorance. He heard boots again, German voices, closer this time, maybe 30 yards out, and he made a decision that felt half crazy even as he committed to it. He'd memorized the terrain before the fog had rolled in. Knew there was a slight rise about 35 yards northwest where the Germans liked to pause during patrols. Knew they felt safe there because the fog made them invisible. He aimed at where memory told him that rise should be, but instead of trusting his instinct about windage, he watched the string. It was pulling gently left, twisted by a crosswind he couldn't feel. He adjusted right, more than felt natural, almost more than felt sane, holding the rifle at an angle that looked wrong. The voices stopped. Someone was standing still. He breathed out slowly, let his heart settle into the space between beats, and squeezed the trigger. The Springfield kicked. The shot cracked flat and strange in the fog, and for a long second there was nothing, just white silence, and then he heard it. A heavy sound, unmistakably a body hitting earth, and then shouting, confused shouting, German voices yelling for a medic, and the beautiful chaos of an enemy who had no idea where the shot had originated because the fog had swallowed the muzzle flash and distorted the sound. He'd hit someone. After 2 days of futility, he'd threaded a bullet through impossible conditions and connected with a target he'd never seen. The Germans returned fire, but in the wrong direction. Their rounds snapping through trees 20 yards to his left, and Mercer stayed frozen, not even breathing loud, watching his little piece of string slowly twist in the air. Over the next 4 days, as the fog persisted with stubborn permanence, he refined the technique into something approaching science. He added a second string, this one longer, about 10 inches, attached to the scope mount because he noticed that strings of different lengths responded to wind differently. The shorter one caught immediate surface currents while the longer one showed slightly deeper air movement, and by comparing them he could build a more complete picture of what was happening in his shooting. Environment. He learned that in rain, which came frequently, the strings became more sensitive because water droplets would load them down and exaggerate every tiny movement, turning subtle wind into obvious motion. He learned that just after dawn, when temperature inversions were strongest, the strings would show completely different readings at rifle height versus when he lowered the gun toward the ground, revealing vertical wind shear that would affect bullet drop in ways he'd never considered. He learned to wait, sometimes for 20 minutes or more, watching the strings until their movements settled into patterns he could read, learning the language they spoke. The kills accumulated with strange inevitability. A German machine gun team set up in the fog, confident in their invisibility, and he heard them arranging ammunition belts, heard the gun's tripod legs being adjusted, and he aimed toward the sounds with the strings telling him to compensate hard right for a crosswind channeling through a gap in the trees. The first shot took the gunner, the second shot, fired 6 seconds later while the strings showed the same pattern, took the assistant gunner, and by the time he fired the third the remaining Germans were running, crashing through brush in panic, firing wildly at nothing. A patrol moving along a trail he'd memorized, their discipline loose because they believed the fog protected them, and he worked through them methodically, one every 3 or 4 minutes, waiting for the strings to show consistent air movement before each shot, and they couldn't locate him, couldn't even determine a general direction because the fog bent sound around trees and swallowed it in weird ways. He heard them calling to each other, heard the fear creeping into their voices, heard them abandon their route and flee back the way they'd come. A German officer. He knew it was an officer because the voice was giving commands, trying to organize a countersniper effort, and that was maybe the most satisfying kill because he heard the man ordering his troops to search the fog, heard him demanding they find the American sniper, and then Mercer let the strings settle and put a round through where the voice was coming from and the commands stopped mid-sentence. The Germans started calling him Der Nebelgeist, the fog ghost, or at least that's what one prisoner told an intelligence officer later, said that whole squads were refusing to patrol when the fog was thick, said there were rumors of an American who could shoot through solid white, who never missed, who appeared and disappeared like smoke. The truth was less mystical. Just a Montana farm kid who'd figured out that wind doesn't disappear in fog, it just hides, and who'd found a way to make it visible again with bootlace and observation. The psychological effect became almost more valuable than the casualties. German movements through that sector slowed dramatically. Patrols that used to pass through every few hours became rare. When they did come, they moved fast and fearful, talking in whispers, and they'd abandoned their casual confidence entirely. Mercer would hear them arguing before entering the fog zones, hear younger soldiers refusing to go first, hear sergeants having to threaten and cajole. One patrol actually turned back completely. He heard them approach, heard them stop at the fog line where the mist thickened, heard a heated discussion in German, and then heard them retreat. The fog had become weaponized territory, and he was the weapon. His company commander came up once, crawling through the mud to Mercer's position, and asked how he was doing it, how he was getting kills in conditions where nobody should be able to hit anything, and Mercer showed him the strings. The commander stared at them for a long moment, these two pathetic pieces of frayed cord dangling from the rifle, and said, "You figured this out yourself?" And Mercer nodded, and the commander just shook his head and said, "Don't lose that rifle," which wasn't exactly praise but was acknowledgement. They didn't publicize it, didn't write it up as some innovation to be shared, because the fog wasn't everywhere and the technique was so specific to these exact conditions that it probably wouldn't translate to other theaters or other weather, and also because explaining that one private had been stopping German patrols with bootlace would make the Army's extensive training apparatus look somewhat foolish. By Mercer's private count, verified only by his own certainty about which shots had connected, he hit 41 Germans over 6 days of fog, though official records would list it vaguely as enemy casualties during reduced visibility operations, without attribution to any individual. Some were kills, some were wounds, he had no way to know for certain, but he heard the impacts, heard the sounds that followed, and he trusted his judgment. The 41st came on the 6th morning, when the fog was finally starting to break up, becoming patchy instead of solid, and he could see shapes moving in the white, actual visual targets instead of remembered positions and hoped for geometry. It was almost disappointing how easy it became when sight returned. How ordinary. The final German was a scout, moving carefully through thinning mist, and Mercer watched him appear and disappear as fog patches drifted, watched his strings showing a tricky sidewind that was gusting and inconsistent, waited through 3 opportunities because the wind wasn't stable, and finally on the 4th appearance, when the strings showed a momentary calm, he took the shot and the scout dropped, and that was that. The fog lifted fully by noon, burned off by weak November sun, and Mercer could see the forest clearly for the first time in a week. It looked different than he remembered, smaller somehow, less mysterious, just trees and mud and the ordinary debris of war. He found 3 bodies he'd shot at ranges he'd estimated wrong. One man had been only 20 yards away when Mercer had guessed 35, which meant his bullet had been dropping faster than expected and he'd accidentally compensated correctly. Another had been 50 yards out when he'd thought 40, but a helpful crosswind had carried the round onto target anyway. Luck and physics had collaborated in ways he hadn't understood in the moment. He untied the strings from his rifle, wound them around his fingers, and put them in his breast pocket, though he wasn't sure why he was keeping them. They were just trash, frayed pieces of cordage with no intrinsic value. Maybe evidence that improvisation mattered more than doctrine, that observation beat training, that the solution to impossible problems sometimes came from noticing what moved when everything seemed still. His grandfather used to say that hunting wasn't about being the best shot but about being the most patient watcher, about understanding that the world was always telling you things if you paid attention, and the old man had been right in ways that turned out to matter in a German forest 7,000 miles from Montana. Mercer rotated off the line that afternoon, replaced by another sniper team who arrived with proper equipment and confident attitudes, and he didn't tell them about the strings because the fog was gone and probably wouldn't return like that, and anyway the technique felt personal, like something that had worked for him specifically because he'd discovered it himself, had tested it himself, had trusted it when trust was hard. Back at the company position, someone asked him how many he'd gotten and he said he didn't know, which was a lie but felt appropriate because precise counts seemed wrong somehow, seemed to miss the point. The war had 8 more months to run and he'd spend most of it doing ordinary sniper work in ordinary conditions, taking shots where he could see his targets and judge wind by watching trees and grass like he'd been trained, and those kills felt different, more mechanical, less like solving puzzles. He survived the war, went home to Montana, worked the family ranch, raised 3 kids, and died in 1998 at 77 years old without ever telling the story to anyone except his wife once, late at night after whiskey, and she'd listened and said it sounded lonely, shooting at people you couldn't see in fog so thick you couldn't see your own hands, and he'd agreed that yes, it had been lonely but also clarifying, because the fog had stripped away everything complicated and left only the essential problem. Reading air currents he couldn't see to guide bullets through space, he couldn't measure toward targets he couldn't confirm. And he'd solved it with string and patience and the willingness to trust information that contradicted his instincts. The Army taught him how to shoot, how to clean his rifle, how to estimate range and calculate windage and control his breathing, and all of that had been useless when the fog rolled in and erased the visible world. But the rain taught him how to see, taught him that invisible things still had effects, taught him that wind doesn't disappear just because you can't feel it, it just lies, waiting for something light enough and sensitive enough to reveal its presence. And in that German forest in November 1944, 2 pieces of bootlace had been exactly sensitive enough, exactly light enough, exactly right. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.